to the Consciousness Anywhere and Everywhere podcast. I am Shannon O'Hara, and I invite you to a completely new world of possibilities. Am I crazy? Welcome to one of the most Google questions on the internet, sadly, but truly, am I crazy? So welcome to a intermittent episode of the Consciousness Anywhere podcast. If you are a loyal listener of the podcast, you would know that I haven't released a podcast in quite some months. I did make an announcement in the last one that I was going to just sort of like be making these, I was going to be making these less consistently, sort of like when the inspiration struck, and ta-da, the inspiration struck. So I'm going to talk about something a bit controversial today, and we did this like search of like the most searched, like, actually, I don't know how my husband did it, but he searched like these things like that were the most searched questions on Google, but I'm sure there's like a criteria for that. Like what's wrong with me was number one. And then am I crazy is number two. I did a podcast episode on what's wrong with me quite some months ago. So if you haven't listened to that, please do in addition to this one. And if you're new to the podcast, if you're just sort of hearing me for the first time, like there is a great library of past episodes for a bunch of life-changing information. Am I crazy? So I was looking at this question, and I would like to start this with two different paths of crazy. Number one, there is what I would probably consider like, actually, how do we define crazy? I looked it up in the several different dictionaries. I looked it up in the Webster 1828 dictionary. Definition of crazy, full of cracks and flaws, not mentally sound, marked by thought or action that lacks reason. So that's in the Webster's dictionary. Etymology.com, crazy, from 1570. Diseased and sickly, broken, impaired, full of cracks and flaws. And then there's the Google definition. Mad, especially as manifested in wild and aggressive behavior. Number two, extremely enthusiastic. I like that definition of crazy. So as you can tell, there are sort of three different definitions depending on the source you look at. Cracked and flawed seems to be the older definition, the pretty universal older definition, the etymology. And so we live in a world where many people's differences are sort of perverted and mutated into crazy or insane. And if you feel like you're crazy, it's probably you're not alone. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of support for what I believe creates awareness for those of us that are different. So I've dealt a lot with this question of, am I crazy? Being that my first and primary business, the business that I really like broke into sort of like adulthood with and has really been my bread and butter for so many years, is Talk to the Entities. So I was one of these kids that saw ghosts and heard ghosts. And if that is basically considered clinically insane, if you hear voices or see spirits, and fortunately, I grew up in a family that didn't condemn that and sort of was more evolved than that. And I then went on to discover like what I knew, but I really had to go through the threshold of like, am I crazy? Am I making this up? Am I totally like, bonkers? But after years of claiming what I know, doing sessions, facilitating classes, and discovering again and again and again and again and again that what I'm perceiving with entities is actually true and real and valid, I realized that like I wasn't actually crazy. I was perceiving something that other people, basically this reality or other people, judge as crazy. So I think that there's two different kinds of crazy we're talking about here. There's, I would say like real insanity, which of course, like how do you determine what's really insane? Like I'm not a clinical psychologist, nor do I believe that clinical psychologists actually have the answer to this. I think that they're just as behind as religion and science when it comes to things that are different. Of course, not every clinical psychologist is the same. This is not a blanket statement, but I am going to be controversial in saying that if you're looking for somebody else to validate you, to make you okay, or to diagnose you so that you can sort of fit into this reality, probably not the greatest sort of source of freedom. I would go so far as to say that even very dynamic or intense expressions of what would be considered insanity in this reality, such as being bipolar or schizophrenic, multiple personality, might not actually be people being crazy. It is oftentimes people being like super aware of entities. And so my motto of, in Talk to the Entities is let's educate, not medicate. And this is actually not supposed to be a conversation about Talk to the Entities. This is actually to address the question of, am I crazy? Because if you're out there and you're listening to this and you have wondered if you're crazy, or you've had some awareness and you've rejected it based on that it doesn't fit the reason and logic of like normal society, you're not alone in that. And the thing that you have to know is that this reality, and definitely people, like, judges so much out of existence, judges so much that's different out of existence. And when I say different, it's like those of us that, in my example, like, am aware of ghosts, but then there's all the other examples of people who can hear other people thinking, or people who, they just don't fit because either they're different, or even like autistic. There's so much difference in the world that's not accepted. And even now, I think we're like sort of more evolved than ever before, but there's still so much that, number one, science can't measure. And if science can't measure it, is it real? Of course it is. Even a true scientist knows that they haven't discovered everything, and that there's constant discovery. So there is so much more that's possible. And if you're one of these people that has access to either some part of reality that like your parents wouldn't accept, or like you weren't allowed to have as a child, or you're not allowed to have in your marriage, or your friends will think you're weird, or society will think you're weird, that's a different kind of crazy, right? That's like you don't fit. That's not you're crazy, that's you don't fit. And we really need to know the difference between like real crazy, which I think is a difficult definition, and then like you don't fit, like I'm crazy different, right? And they're different. Those are two different areas. It's the same word, but it's very different things. True crazy, I think, has to be up for you to determine. And I watched, I remember years ago, like 13, 14, 15 years ago, I watched this. There was this documentary. I was living in Sweden at the time. And there was this documentary on the television about the Heaven's Gate cult, which was a cult in Southern California. It was like really famous for, they all put on Nikes and like drank arsenic, I think, in their Kool-Aid, and like committed like group suicide together. Which there are many cults that have done group suicides together, but that was just, this documentary was about that one. And I was like watching it and I was like fascinated. And by the time I got to the end of the documentary, I was like completely freaked out. And like they did these interviews, they showed these interviews with some of the cult members, like doing these, talking about what was like Hail Bob and, what was going to happen, and sort of like, and like looking in their eyes. That was the first time in my adult life I had actually looked into the eyes of like true insanity. And it totally freaked me out. I was like completely keyed in by it. And I actually spoke to my dad, Gary Douglas, founder and creator of Access Consciousness. I had to call him the next day because I was like so weirded out. I needed help. And he said, and I told him I'd watched this documentary about the Heaven's Gate cult. And he's like, yeah. So it's like, did you look in the eyes of true insanity? And I was like, yeah, but now what? Because I was like totally kind of stuck with it, because I am extremely aware, I'm extremely psychic, and like it was super easy for me to sort of like go into their universes. And as soon as I went into those cult members' universes, like I got totally lost in the insanity, because I hadn't really ever acknowledged for myself that there was such a thing as true insanity, where you get completely lost in this I don't know what you get lost in, but there isn't a sense of self. Like I didn't have myself, I had no peace. It was just very difficult, which I think anybody who has suffered with insanity or been institutionalized knows what I mean. So he's like, did you look in the eyes of true insanity? I was like, yeah, but then what? And he goes, well, have you ever acknowledged like the edge of sanity and insanity? And for me, I had never really learned to distinguish it, because we throw around this word crazy a lot. Like, oh my God, that's so crazy. Or oh my God, I'm being so crazy. Like, oh my God, you're crazy. Like it's a joke. And then when you watch documentaries about cults, that's a whole different kind of crazy. So, I mean, even I think it's really super funny in the Google definition of insanity that comes up on Google. What is it? Extremely enthusiastic. Like, so when we say crazy, it can mean all these different things, like, and I am oftentimes extremely enthusiastic. So I am oftentimes, by that definition, crazy. But is that wrong? And so then what gets attached to this am I crazy thing, and what gets attached to crazy, which is a very triggering word and a word full of judgment. Right? Like, I think, I don't know for a fact, but I'm pretty sure that like in clinical psychology and in like mental medicine that they don't use the word crazy. Obviously, like they don't use the word retarded anymore for diagnoses. It's too indirect, it's too non-specific, and it is like a really judgy word. So you got to look at it. It's like, if you think you're crazy, like if you're like, am I crazy? Like legit, if you're really questioning if you're crazy. One of the things that I had to do was really look at, like, because I see ghosts, because I talk to ghosts. I mean, I've asked myself this question a million times. Am I crazy? Am I making this up? And for me, I sort of had the fortitude and the wherewithal to really look at it for myself. And this is something that I think we underestimate, this looking at it for ourselves rather than getting somebody else to validate us. Oh no, you're not crazy. Or yes, you are diagnosed as this. First of all, nobody knows you better than you. Fact. Nobody knows your unique situation better than you. You are actually the only one who can know what's true for you. You could even easily say that wanting somebody else to validate you or be the source of your knowing is a form of insanity. It's a lack of self. And it's looking for a power outside of you, which is what a lot of people do with doctors. What does my dad call them? M-deities, right? Like we look for a power outside of us. Is that a form of insanity? I think there's also this definition of insanity. What is it? Like this one really caught on, even though it's not an actual definition of insanity if you look in the dictionary. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get a different result. I'm not really sure who popularized that definition of insanity, but I've heard a lot of people say it. And I was thinking about that because is that insanity, or is that just like extreme stupidity? Right? That's like stupidity taken to like the nth degree, like doing the same thing over and over again and not noticing that it's not working. So is that crazy? Is that insane? Or is that just really heavily stupid? Is stupidity curable? Is insanity curable? It depends on the kind of insanity you're talking about. But for those of you guys that are listening to this that have actually suffered from the burden of the judgment of am I insane? It's like, no, you're probably not. Like if you're listening to this podcast, like you're probably not insane. You're probably just extremely different. And where do you fit? And it's like, if you can't fit, does that make you crazy? Or does that just make reality or this reality or people's willingness to be open to different things lacking? So you have to really look at this for yourself. I mean, there is literally nobody who can determine or dictate or cast judgment upon your sanity or not. Not a judge, not a doctor, not a parent, no one really. And I mean, I know these women who, 15 years older than me, but have been good friends of mine who, I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about all these people that I've known who have been institutionalized. Women that I've worked with over the years who have gotten more conscious, who are hugely intelligent, very creative, but very different. And there's a lot of people who are driven crazy by being invalidated constantly. And you have to recognize that that's like a thing. There's a movie called Gaslighting that's from like the 1940s, I think. And I can't remember who's in it, but my dad talks about it like all the time. That's literally about, it's the story of a woman who's constantly told that what she is aware of is wrong. So she's constantly invalidated. And in so doing, her husband basically drives her insane. Like, she goes insane. But how much knowing did she have to give up in that process, right? Like, you don't just go crazy. Like, you give up your knowing and you divert. You want to believe that what the people that you care about are saying is true. You know, like, if you care about your mom and she tells you you're wrong, like, conflict time. And you have to learn the difference between like a conflict and crazy. Because like, if you're in a conflict between what you know and like what your mom tells you is real or right or true, or what your husband tells you is real or right or true, or what your priest tells you is real or right or true, or what your best friend tells you is real or right or true, like, that's not crazy. That's like, you're in conflict between what you know and what their point of view is. So I think that a lot of this crazies thing actually boils down to sort of like knowing what you know and being smart enough to know the difference between when you're really being crazy. Like, because and again, when I say this word crazy, it can mean so many different things. But I just had like a huge breakthrough. Not just, I mean, this was actually a couple years ago, but I had this, like, I went through like, am I crazy with entities? And that I worked through that to a huge degree in a very successful way. And then in my marriage, I was noticing I was doing these things where I was like, I was actually asking myself, I was like, am I being a crazy bitch? Am I being a crazy bitch? And I remember at one point, I was in this like upset with my husband, and I like stopped talking to him and I like looked at it for myself and I was like, am I being a total crazy person? And I actually realized that I was being insane. Not because I was judging myself. I wasn't like, oh my God, I'm so wrong, I'm crazy. I realized that what I was doing, what I was saying, how I was behaving was, I was on this like loop that no matter what he said and no matter what, I would just keep on going on this loop of something that wasn't working. And I think this harkens back to the doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get a different result statement. It's like that. I was doing the same thing over and over again that was creating conflict and upset in the marriage. And it wasn't based on honor of my husband or I. There was no gratitude in it. There was no allowance for me or him. There was no caring, essentially. And so that, I remember that day and I remember that moment where I was like, okay, I'm being crazy. Like, I acknowledged it, but not in a judgy way, just in a like, okay, I'm being crazy. And then I went, okay, no, I'm not going there. And it was like a choice I had to make. So in this sense, I like cured myself of that insanity through choice, which is the possibility and option that all of us have, but we have to be like really honest with ourselves and like not in judgment. If you get judgy, that is not going to get you out of crazy. That is just going to instill and re-solidify and reinforce the behavior that you do over and over again that doesn't work. So I think I didn't really realize how like big this question was. I mean, it's such a charged question, like, am I crazy? It's completely the wrong question, because it's just as bad of a question of like, as what's wrong with me? Because as soon as you ask what's wrong with you, then the universe will show you everything that you've judged and determined is wrong with you. As soon as you ask like, am I crazy? Like, I'm sure like that's just reinforcing the fact that you're crazy. So here's a tool that's really worked a charm for me that I highly recommend, is that when you're like in a huge, like when you either feel crazy or like you're in a huge like spectrum of wrongness, which oftentimes I think can probably bleed together, you have to ask, what am I aware of? What am I aware of? What am I aware of? Not, am I crazy? Like, what are you aware of? This is the only way you're going to start to break apart those like chains of limitation and start to develop a broader spectrum of consciousness that isn't the loop of crazy. What am I aware of? Now, once you're in the awareness seeking, welcome to the vast kingdom of possibility. That's where everything that you've been like unwilling to know and unwilling to be aware of gets pushed, which is frankly a lot of stuff. There is so much awareness and information that is so not allowed to exist in this reality. I mean, so many relationships are based on lies. So many families are based on lies. So many of our lives are based on lies. So if you're going to start to be aware, you're going to start to run into like all the stuff that no one ever acknowledges is real and true, that is actually there. And it's like, how many of you guys perceive stuff? I've had this a lot in my life personally, where I perceive stuff, but like no one else is paying attention to it or acknowledges that it exists. And as soon as I mention it, like they make me wrong rather than them acknowledging or looking at, okay, wow, like, yeah, what is this awareness? So I hope this helps those of you guys out there who feel super wrong and invalidated by being aware of stuff that other people don't want to be aware of. In fact, they don't want you to be aware of it. Hence the whole gaslighting dynamic that occurs. And none of us is a victim to awareness. All of us can choose. And you have to choose to be like aware. No one's going to make you okay for you but you. What are you looking for other people to be or do for you that really only you can be or do for you? How's it get better than this, you guys? Be amazing. Be crazy enthusiastic. Be crazy different. Be crazy aware. And what if everything you think is wrong about you is actually what's strong about you? Love you guys. Bye. Thank you for listening to this show. My target is to make consciousness easy to find and choose. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a 5-star review on iTunes and share this with somebody who you know who might be looking for more consciousness in their life. You can visit me on shannon-o'hara.com or talktotheentities.com. And to learn more about the amazing tools of Access Consciousness, you can visit accessconsciousness.com and be sure to subscribe to the podcast.